Well, my name is easy. I'm George Hampton. I'm retired. And I do urban planning, urban studies, healthcare reform. One title is I'm the Director of Healthcare Reform for what's called New Jersey Appleseed. I have other titles, but that's good enough for now, I think. Former Vice President, maybe you may need to know that. I'm the former Vice President of Urban and Community Relations for the University of Medicine and Dentistry, and I was there that 26-year period, and that's what got me to retire after that. And I retired early, thank you very much, meaning I'm still relatively young.
Great. I was wondering if you could talk to me a little bit about the city of Newark through maybe the late 50s, the 60s, the kind of times that were brewing, maybe what was going on in the city, what kind of social forces were going on, how were folks living.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I know like many other urban cities, deindustrialization took away a lot of jobs that folks had. Not everybody was prepared for the service industry. Also, if all the jobs leave, who are you really serving? Maybe talk just about the city itself and what was going on at that time.
Well, a couple of different things, because again, when I look at it as being trained, I'm an urban planner trained from Rutgers University Newark campus. So I have somewhat of an understanding of urban dynamics in a variety of ways, and I look at Newark from that perspective. But I also grew up here in Newark, so I went to elementary school, junior high, high school, and even college right here in the city. And those were during some of those years. And Newark probably peaked in its population and its so-called, when it was like a true so-called Renaissance city or that kind of thing, probably more like in the 40s, late 40s was at the top of its population, which would have been about 400,000 people from what I recall. Old data, but you know. Anyway, the point is, after that, after it peaked around the late 40s, maybe a little bit into the 50s, outmigration started occurring, which was occurring throughout the whole country. And that is, people were leaving cities, going in the suburbs and other things. The middle classes were middle and upper classes were leaving, going to other places. Initially, they were, I might add, white folk. And the people of color were the ones who were concentrated in cities. But the reality is, as time went on, and I'm now jumping all the way up to the 70s and 80s and beyond, middle class blacks and others started out migrating too. So I've discovered that, and I thought it very interesting. That was a very interesting phenomenon that happened. But the 50s was again, I was a kid, 10-ish, thank you very much. But the point is that the 50s and early 60s, there was concentrations of poor blacks, concentrated in neighborhoods, Central Ward, but the different wards of the city were very ethnic. The North Ward was primarily Italians. The South Ward, very nice middle class. Working class might be it's really what they were in retrospect. At the time, I thought they were rich. They weren't rich, they were working class. In the North Ward, and you might mention, I might add, when you do talk to Imama or Miri or juniors, ask them about Kawaida Towers. So they could tell you about the dynamics of that, and that's where Kawaida, being an African word, I wanted to bring an African so-called concept, housing, to the North Ward. Boy, did that not work. But anyway, the Weequahic section, or the South Ward, was primarily Jewish. I think the West Ward was probably more at that time, a little like Irish, Italian. The Central Ward was primarily the place where blacks were, and I might add poor blacks, because that's all they were. They were black and they were poor. The East Ward was always the Portuguese and other ethnic groups like that. So those were the dynamics as it relates to race. Very corrupt. The 50s and 60s, very corrupt, especially the 60s. Adonisio had been a long-term mayor for a very long period of time. And as typical of really, I might even say for many big city, so-called big city governments, you know, the Mayor Daley's of the world were in many other locations. The Daley's of Chicago. In Newark, we had an Adonisio, a Hugh Adonisio, who was pretty much the same thing. There were different times one or two council persons at best who would be black, and that was the best you could get. Ken Gibson came around 1970, but during the 60s is when all these other things were happening. We were coming out of the high schools back then. I graduated from what was then called Southside High School in 1967. I was student council president. Thank you very much. Very proud. 2 years in a row, thank you. But nonetheless, when we came out of the high schools, started going to the colleges. I got scholarships to traditionally black, historically black colleges. Chose to stay here in this city. My mom, who was the breadwinner, wasn't the primary breadwinner, the sole breadwinner, on and off of welfare. You know, very typical kinds of stuff. And she had 3 kids, but there was primarily no men in the house for long periods of time. But that's cool. You know, I think we all grew up very well, so I think I find that very interesting about the complaints about that. But those were the times, but very segregated. Issues about race, the police were there to protect and serve white folk. You did not go out of your neighborhood if you were of color. At night, if you did, you got chased back to your neighborhood. And there were a lot of fights about if you were to go into the North Ward, as example. A lot of Italian black clashes, and there was a guy named Anthony Imperielli. You've heard some of this, I'm sure, by now. That's kind of like what Newark was happening, but it was happening everywhere. You know, you've heard about the industrialization and out-migrations of jobs, and also out-migrations of folk. Servicing industries were starting a little bit to come in, but not by any means at the levels that they needed. So what we did with Ken Gibson was, when Ken Gibson came about, that was now 1970. Yeah, 1970. And we had already taken over the building here. You know, we did that in '69. Now the '70s are coming, and all the welfare rights and this kind of stuff you'll talk about with Junius Williams. But when Gibson took over, there were those of us who came out of the colleges, because I can't say their numbers were large, of color. We were first generations who had gone to college, blacks, and we all ended up, a great many of us ended up working in social service, took social service courses. And what I mean by that, we did the civic stuff, the government jobs. We weren't a lot of entrepreneurs. We weren't really a lot into business. We were more into society and trying to improve it. So politics became a very important thing. And when Gibson came in, many of us ended up working in city government. So Richard Roper did, Newark government. Richard Roper did, George Hampton did, Junius Williams did, and you'll talk to them, I have talked to them, and you may have seen some of that. It was the year '67, I'm bouncing back though, because a major project that I had done, both with the city and with Rutgers Newark, I was on I came out of what was called an Office of Newark Studies. And that Office of Newark Studies was, it was like the think tank for Ken Gibson's office. We didn't deal with politics, we just did studies. And we found problems, urban problems, and we looked for ways to solve them by getting grants from somewhere to address it, or monies from other places. One of the big things that started happening, we saw in the '60s and then into the '70s, was something called redlining of cities. So the first study that I did, the first redlining study in a major city on the East Coast at that time, and it was for Newark, New Jersey, and where I analyzed what happened with 26 banks and where they were putting money and where they were not. And of course, all the neighborhoods, all the areas that were black were the places where monies were not going. But I went back in the time. When we did that study, it was around 1975. But I went back to the year 1967. And I think this is a very important point that often is missed when we have these kind of dialogues. And that is that '67 was the year of the riots, and riots for Newark. It was also the same year that I left high school to go. '67 was I started here at Rutgers Newark, the September. But during that period of leaving Southside to come here, during that summer were these riots that had happened, race riots, call it what you will, rebellions, there's tons of different names for what it was called and what happened. But but looking at it economically, what it showed was mortgaging activity. I just studied something as strange as mortgage. What the hell is mortgaging activity? It means a transaction. It's the financial transactions where every year people are buying and selling homes. Well, what the data showed was before 1967, there had been more or less a trending of mortgage. The same amount of mortgaging activity was happening more or less every year. In fact, it even was going up a little bit like that. Suddenly in the year '67 behind the riots, and then '67, '68, and '69, mortgaging activity just fell off, almost dropped to, just really extremely low. And what that showed was the economy of the city was just disappearing. And subsequent years, it also showed that people of color, in these poor neighborhoods especially, just could not have access to capital of any type. And it showed that. So what's the point? I'm trying to give you a sense of what those times were like. In the '70s, after doing such studies, we started doing things like called greenlining. Today they're called CRA, Community Reinvestment Acts, where banks and others are supposed to take some of their monies and put them back into neighborhoods. And there's a lot of folks, you might even want to talk to others, like there's a guy here called Bob Holmes. I don't know if you know him or not, but he has done a lot with Mount Laurel. And I've told you about, incidentally, these are the reports, New Jersey Public Policy Research Institute. You don't forget that, because New Jersey Public Policy Research Institute, we've looked at all of these transactions. And if you want to look at Mount Laurel and what's supposed to happen with housing in subsequent years, it's a great place to show you what the issues were at that particular time. But as we went from the '70s, Gibson being mayor, we originally thought that at last, our problems are solved because we now have, looking at it from a racial perspective, we have in place a black mayor, and across the country, mayors in major cities were becoming, suddenly the first time around, these black mayors were coming to cities. And we used to think that, well, I remember I used to think about Newark being the new modern day Timbuktu. It was going to be this great place where, people of color was going to be in all positions of government, and we were going to work together, and we were going to hold hands, and we'd be, just singing Kumbaya and how. No, none of that happened. The reality is it stayed exceptionally poor for very long periods of time for a variety of other reasons. So that's a long story, but that's my short version of trying to tell you what those periods were like. I mean, we could get into educational issues and healthcare and tons of other stuff, many of which exist today, I might still add. But why don't you ask me another question?
I was wondering, during the period of the '60s into the '70s that you spoke about, I know that through reading some of Roper's statements about how the NAACP was not serving
That's right.
the community as much as it should.
That's here. Well, that was here.
Yeah.
We primarily,
And it needed to have a little more teeth, if
Right.
I may
Right.
put it to those terms.
Right.
And I know that the civil rights movement was actually going on at the same time, and I guess in conjunction with the anti-war movement for Vietnam. But the way I see it is that a lot of it was when black soldiers went over there, they thought, we're probably fighting on the wrong side of this. Here are other people of color. Here's the U.S. Pretty much switching sides after World War II, and fighting other folks of color when we have folks of color suffering at home, and look at our imperialistic nation.
Right.
And that's
Right.
where the liberation of the third world movement comes out of too, and that has a lot of strong black nationalist statements. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
A couple of points. Well, first off, when you start sending me some emails, I'll send a couple of them back to your little documentaries. I'll send a few short-term documentaries to you, and I can't think of the name of one of them, the guy that actually did it. But anyway, there's a discussion about if you really look at since World War II, all the countries that have been bombed by the United States, and you'll see this list of like 20-some countries. I'm just pulling out a number, but the point is, I dare say 18 of them were places of color. I mean, that's where all the bombing and the wars are presently being generated. It's quite easy to do that. Let's start with the point about the NAACP and why we changed.
I'm sorry, could I pause this for 1 second?
Well, we may have to work. I'm going to imagine you 5 years from now. That's all. Just 5 years. That's all.
Can I assure you they're all going to be tan?
Well, that's cool. That can work. But I'm cool with whether they were
Just
albinos. It could be albino for as I care. The NAACP and what had happened here was, well, I got here in '67. I think Richard came and others about '65, and there were very few blacks on campus. But we chose to create. I was part of the group that created the first year Black Organization of Students, because we were young and on one hand, but we felt that it's sort of hard to say this because being older and looking back versus how we felt then, I think we did some good things, but we weren't pure either. I mean, we were naive in certain ways too. But the point I guess I'm making is that we felt that National Association for the Advancement of Colored People just was not what we should be about. If you take a look at that document, in that document, I call it the, what do you call it document? I call it the drinker document, but he'll tell you the role that I played with pulling that thing together. If you look at my section, I talked about all of these different little issues of color and how there were those who thought that we were, myself especially, like I didn't wear the afro, I didn't have an afro, I didn't wear the dashiki, but at the same time, and most time in fact I wore suits, very bright colored suits, but that was my culture in my opinion, but others, depending on the so-called intellectual Pan-Africans and others, weren't crazy about the way I dressed because it wasn't African enough or it wasn't black enough. I thought it was, and I didn't change, but that's another story. But the point was, we did feel that we had to take it to that next level of confronting the men, being more assertive and aggressive and being more willing to be what they called militant at that time. Because just bowing down, kowtowing, agreeing, and doing things, which apparently what they were doing, quite honestly, our parents, I'm talking about, and our parents' parents, they were doing the best they can for people of color in the situations that they were in. Okay? We didn't see it. All we saw were older black men shuffling and looking, all of the above, and smiling and, oh, yes, master, yeah. And I understand now more than I did then. But so we didn't want to be associated with that. We wanted to be, look, we are somebody. I am somebody. I mean, Jesse Jackson used to say it. It was so apropos. The times were different. The music was, it's hard for young folk today have asked me this so many times, and it's like, again, I try to explain a little bit of it in that little write-up. Why? My kids. I have two sons, your age, more actually older than you. Anyway, the point is, why would we go out and risk so much? Why would we just not go in, get our little education, get our degree, and we were first generations that had that opportunity. Why didn't we just get our little degree, go down here and make some money? My mother would have been so happy if I had just worked at the post office, because you have a real job, you know. Just work at the if you could just get a job at the without a degree. I'm just saying so. So here we are. We have this great opportunity to be in a white school. My God, we have a chance to be in an all-white university. You are there, and you are messing up like this? I mean, if there was anyone that, and all of us talked about that we were afraid of, it was our parents, because they could not understand us. But it was of the times. We had no choice. We really had no choice. I don't see that today, and I'm not saying, I don't necessarily think, I have different opinions of it, but there isn't the connectiveness today. When we were students, we had no choice. It was our responsibility to be concerned, worried about people of color for the whole. We carried the burden of the race on our shoulders, and we had no choice. The music, the music that we listened to was not, excuse my French, and I don't know if I'll say it now, but I don't, you know. But our music was not blaring, nigga this, nigga, you know, what's your mom name? Nigga, what's your mom name? You know, that was not our thing. In fact, it was just the absolute opposite of that. It still to this day blows my mind. I see now gradually they're starting to slow down, thank God. But at the same time, to see this love of expressing such negativity, you know, for us, we didn't do that. We did just the very opposite. We fought to get the word taken off the TV, out of the media. We did everything we could to get rid of the word, but to get rid of that concept of, you know, shuffling, the imagery of shuffling black men, women, you know, women with all of that. We had to go to the next level. We had no choice. We had to separate from the NAACP because, again, the imagery at that time that was being projected. I understand now, I'm trying to show you that being older, I understand that thinking of that time, and our parents did the best they could for the race under those circumstances. I mean, the Underground Railroads and stuff were real, you know, but my point is, we had to separate from that. We could no longer accept being viewed that way, and we felt there had to be some degree of militancy, if you will. There were great dichotomies of we had lots of. I'm amazed at how we don't have any leaders today, quite honestly, you know, compared to what was around at the time, you know, the Malcolms and the Kings and a bunch of other names, and, you know, Ron Karengas, and there was always somebody new coming around with a new philosophy on how we should be between creating our own societies to just being anti-white, anything but just don't be white, just be anything but white. I mean, you know, so there's all that philosophy and ideology was being sort of passed back and forth. And if you were anybody of any kind, if you were black and of any kind of dignity, you know, had any self-respect, you were a part of that. I've always had issues with it, I mean, from a personal perspective, because I always consider myself a black American as opposed to an African American or Afro-American. We had other names colored, and people had big issues with me calling myself, how dare you say you're an American when you know that we're second class, third class, and they're treating you like this, that, and the, you know, those things are all true. But at the same time, I felt that this was where I was born. So when will it change? I think today, I'm jumping all the way up to the year 2009. Yeah, still. I dare say in 2015 and beyond, now that there is a person of color who is our president, and all these, we have new issues on not only the Rutgers Newark campus, I might add, this diversity issue all over, but that is, now we are now seeing people who are actually 5 years ago were in Africa somewhere, and they have an entirely different view of what being African and even being an American means, becoming a citizen, than what many of us who were here previously. In fact, there are big clashes between those two the young folk in the high schools and stuff. You probably may or may not have seen where you're at in Edison, but certainly here in Newark, there have been big clashes with these different cultures clashing. And I think as time goes on, people are going to go back and say, well, maybe I am a black American. I'm an American and won't be ashamed of doing that. Back to you. You asked me a question, and you could see I could go off and take it in any direction you want me to.
I was wondering if I've been studying Dr. King's 1967 speech,
right,
in which he talks about American imperialism, and that we've committed more crimes against the people of color all over the world than any other nation prior to us.
Right.
And I was wondering if you could speak about how some of that sentiment was also part of civil rights, because after King came out with that speech, he got a lot of harsh criticism.
Oh yeah,
that.
and then
people were calling him a traitor.
Especially when he went against when he started talking against Vietnam.
Absolutely.
Oh yeah.
Absolutely, and that was the '67 speech. He said he could no longer ignore the sin and injustice, and that though many had hoped that he would not speak, he had no choice but to do so. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that, about this idea that folks realized that we were just on the wrong side, and what we're doing to black folks here, we're also doing to brown folks over there, and maybe just something along those lines.
Well, I mean, many of those arguments are still around today. I mean, it depends on how you want to see it, I guess, or how much anxiety can you take on and really want to fight about. But let's go back to the 67s. Yeah, I think a great deal of it, though, while we within the neighborhoods, there was a big Muslim movement, American Muslim movement, Louis Farrakhan and others, Elijah Muhammad, and that there was Malcolm X, of course, and that part had great discussions and a lot of philosophy and a lot of demonstrations about how bad it was in other countries, and how the United States is, of course, well, like I just said to you earlier about the bombings in different places. But I think then probably more so than even now, black Americans had so many problems dealing with their own problems that they weren't able to really spend a lot of time recognizing King's. They accepted it, meaning acknowledge it, that's a better word, not accepted it, but acknowledge the fact. But I think there was enough going on in this country to still try to push for civil rights just here first. You can't take care of others until you start taking care of yourself. But I think it was clearly one of the reasons why there's lots of conspiracy theories that say that's why the real reason King got assassinated was behind his speaking out against the war, and his becoming more of a international figure as opposed to just staying within this country and just speaking for blacks in this country. So, but it was around. I mean, we know that. And, there was nothing. Well, I shouldn't say nothing special. It was even worse in the 40s. I mean, the 60s were bad. But the reality is, the 40s were worse. The 30s were worse. The 20s were, when it comes to race, the race riots that were happening in other parts of the country were phenomenal back then. I mean, the destroying of Greenwood in Ohio and places, entire the so-called Black Wall Street. I mean, there's history. Come on, So I'm saying that to say that the 60s was an awakening, And there was a big realization, and there was this coming together, and probably the best thing out of the 60s, yeah, that's interesting. You're making me say it this way. What happened in the 60s, started growing in the 60s and went into the 70s and started tapering off by the time the 80s came around, was something called Black pride, Black American pride. I think that's what the big difference is here. We recognize what was happening in other places. Clearly, the United States, it was always the bad place, you know, I mean, from our perspective. It was how terrible, you know, the man had all the power, we had none. But our culture reflected this Black pride, this getting back to the man and all of that, started happening after the 60s into the 70s, and then dying out again more or less in the 80s and the 90s started coming around. So yes, there were issues with Vietnam, and yes, the United States was still doing terrible things in other places, but we always knew that, you know, and there are those who could articulate a great deal what that is. But we were, one, I think, really trying to struggle with ourselves and our own identities. But two, if there was something that came out of that period that probably was different than in other periods, it was this issue of pride, Black pride. The music started, Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud, was a very big, and not just one, but musician after musician after musician. And the mere fact that we would wear my hair wouldn't grow, but the point is, you know, I wasn't Pan-African so much, but I was very much into Black American pride, and being, I am somebody meant a whole lot to me and my generation and everyone around me. And as you know, the movies started, you know, not only the music, but the movies, more and more there was, now at last you could see a Black man. I mean, it's one thing to see a woman, it's fine that they would have Black women who would, of course, be the mammies at first and that kind of a thing. Yo, I'm so glad to be, what's wrong with you, massa, you know. But as time went on, even they would always show women before they would show men, of being strong. But in the 70s and 80s, 70s especially, all of a sudden you had these macho men. Now, very campy. I look at the stuff today and I laugh at it. But the Superfly, I thought he was cool. I like Superfly and Shaft and these guys, and they had something going on, and they would not only beat up, they could beat up, you know, their own, but they were fighting against drugs, fighting against, you know, things like that. They were fighting against corruption, and they were fighting the man. I mean, they were punching and shooting. They were killing white people on the big screen. What the heck? What a phenomenal thing to happen at that time. Today it's no big deal, but it was like, whoa! And they could actually make love on TV. I mean, not TV, but well, even a little bit of TV, but make love in the media is a better word. Making love in the media. They were human beings. They weren't just second-class citizens. The point that I'm making here is this issue about pride. And those were the eras where this pride came out. And we fought against the imagery. We fought against a lot of other things. That's why I said we fought. They were, you know, we fought. We wanted to get the word nigger removed from the dictionary. You know, that's a pretty audacious thing to do. So taking over buildings, yeah, we had no choice at 69. But 80s, 90s, now you're into the O's, and a new round of media bombardment's happening, because when you don't control mass media, as you are sitting behind this media, you know, facility here, you don't control the minds. I mean, obviously, if you can bombard them enough, as you said before we started this, if you can just get them to think a different way, they'll start believing what you tell them, and hey, you can still control them, and that's why I think we're controlled today. I went off, I digressed all over the place.
Could you talk to me a little bit about UMDNJ? I know that you were part of the organization for a long time.
Right.
And I know that you're also familiar with all of the housing issues.
All of it. Mhm.
So maybe you could reflect a little bit about that situation, maybe what the university role in that was as well.
Well, Junius would be good for this too, because Junius, we worked together. First off, Junius and I worked in, Richard Junius and I, we actually worked in all this stuff one way or another. Find it interesting now that I'm sitting here thinking about it. But Junius worked in city government. Junius actually hired me to work in the Gibson administration. And then years later, we found ourselves, and we did work before that together with all the welfare rights, and you'll talk about that with him. But the point I'm making is that later on, I ended up at UMD. UMD&J, what the thing about UMD&J was in the late 60s, we had picketed against UMD&J. It was called the New Jersey College of Medicine and Dentistry, because they wanted to take over, it was 140 acres to be exact. Some people say 150, but it was really about 140 acres of land right in the heart of the city. And as opposed to going to the Madison campus, the issue was, so that 140 acres were where people lived. Back then the term was called urban renewal, meant urban removal. And so it just simply meant knocking down all the homes of poor, welfare and other things, folk, and putting in those high-rise projects, we called them back then. They started building up. This is when all these they went, 12, 13, 16-story buildings were being, and they would pile all the poor into these buildings, which didn't, of course, work. And then now they've knocked all of them down. But the point, I'll back up, sorry. But the point about UMD&J is, so we had originally picketed against having it come because it was, destroying neighborhoods. But then, primarily through Junius and a guy named Gus Henningberg and a couple of others, they were the older folk. You don't like to hear that. They created something called the Newark Agreements. Now, the Newark Agreement, which was unprecedented, and to this day, there's always these arguments about whether or not the University of Medicine and Dentistry lived up to the Newark Agreements. Now, so in the 60s, I'm 19, 18, we picketed against the place. Coming period. In the 70s, somewhere in the mid-70s, the Newark Agreements were signed, which means, okay, we'll let the university come, but instead of taking up 150 acres, we'll put it down to 50 acres. And what they're going to have to do is they're going to have to provide health care, they're going to have to provide housing. There's a whole series of things, just like going back to here when we were younger and we took over here, there was supposed to be all these demands, and if the university met those demands, we'll chill out. Well, the Newark Agreements, if the University of Medicine and Dentistry met these agreements, if the state, it really wasn't so much just the University of Medicine and Dentistry, but if the state government, because it was a state institution, would meet all this criteria, come in and we'll work together and we'll do some things. The good news is that there was such an actual document, and these were, I got to admit, these were some strong, brilliant folk. You're going to love talking to Junius, who fought, and Junius was about 23 then. This guy was 23 years old. Okay, so I want you to, anyway, I'm 18. I don't know, but anyway, the point is, I came to UMD&J in 1980 as assistant director of long-range planning. I had gone back to Rutgers and all that. And it was now my job, ultimately, to plan for what the university would look like in the future. And I started doing it, and I enjoyed it. So I began to get a different view. I very quickly was promoted to be vice president for urban and community development for the entire university, which is a statewide organization. And Junius and I, we met from now we're on different sides, but we weren't, because the interesting thing for me was, and you asked that question earlier too, now I'm a university administrator. I'm the man, as you said. I had one person who I reported to who was, the president of the university. But anyone else, as far as I cared, they could, you could kiss with the sun, don't you? I got to deal with this guy, but everybody else got to deal with me. And I loved it, I have to admit. I mean, I loved it. I had the same thing when I was in state government for a while too. But anyway, the point is, now I'm seeing things differently. So what we had to do, and what Marcia does it today, and Miri Barak would say, you got to use what you got to get what you need. We would use, I'm the house Negro now. I'm the man on the inside, you know. I can get the information. I can share the information. We learn to respect each other without always talking about it, without even, in many cases, acknowledging it. And I just found it so fascinating that we would have people out on the outside, I'm on the inside, and we would plan and do things for the betterment of the community. And the beautiful thing for me was being an insider, and it really felt good to see the respect that I always got from others. Now, because I was on the inside, we changed the university around in many ways. UMD&J I'm talking about now, and we had things here too. But we changed a lot. We changed affirmative action. I mean, I had people rehired who were fired and I didn't think it was right. We started developing all kinds of programs. We created what's called pre-college programs, where we would go out into the school systems and get kids at a very early age. Now we started working with all 4 universities in Newark called CHEN, Council on Higher Education in Newark. And we created things to get all 4 of us to go into the high schools at early ages to create pre-college programs. We went around the country and we created what's now called Science Park High School. That was done, the concept was a concept that came from us. If you look around in the neighborhoods, if anywhere you walk around, you'll see something called University Heights. I'm the one who coined the phrase University Heights. And the very first master plan, I'm an urban planner, and the purpose of it was to say we need to use the universities to include everybody. That's really what it was. But we had to do it all the fighting and other things, if you will. Junius is on the outside now, like throwing stones, but at the same time, you had to do that because that meant inclusion. So what did Junius and I do? We built housing. He was, you know, he called for it through the community organizations that we created. And I ended up being I'm always the administrator guy, so we ended up building 66 units, the very first housing that was built during that period when all this out-migration was occurring throughout everywhere else. You know what out-migration, vacancy, Newark just had vacancies all over the place. People were leaving. Keep it, I don't want the land, I don't want the house, I'm leaving. And so my point is, we started developing ways to bring economics, people back to the cities. So we built housing, and we built it through not-for-profits. And juniors can talk to you about the University Heights Neighborhood Development Corporation. And I was vice president of that. We created the University Heights Neighborhood Development, the Condominium Association. I was the president of that. You know, and things like that. But more happened, and I mean, I could give you great detail if you were to ask, but the point is, we're now being an administrator, being on the inside, it was easier I used to run around beating up other administrators to force them to be inclusive. When the 4 universities in Newark were first, in the 60s, the designs of the buildings were designed to be these fortresses. Everybody after 67 built a fortress, keep the community out. By now, by the 90s, really the 90s when we really started we started in 1982 is when University Heights actually started. But by the 90s and upwards, all the universities, as we putting in new buildings, we're opening up the campuses now. We're bringing in retail and other things to create a college-like, that's why I'd asked you that question earlier. I said, why would you want to come back to Newark? Well, we want to create a college-like atmosphere. But now why is this important, going back to the issues of race, and why is this important when you deal with diversity and things like that? Because we use our ability, we are still frustrated revolutionists of the 60s. You know, we just do it in a different way now. You know, I mean, yeah, I wear, you know, very expensive suits, thank you very much. Today I didn't, but typically I have on one of my tailor-made suits or my tailor-made shirts, but nonetheless, the point that I'm making is we use our skills and our contacts to continue to struggle. By no means is the struggle over. but a lot has happened because, quite frankly, the Marsha Browns and others, and the Clement Prices, what few there may be, are on these campuses, taking a lot of heat from those who don't know who these people are. Because if they walk in certain places and they don't realize what these people have done, they just, well, now you have on a tie, you think you know, I've gone through all that too, and I'm sitting there listening, smiling. But we have been able to do tremendous things because of our presence being here. And I take pride in that. I take pride in what's happening with the high school stuff. I take pride in University Heights. I think there's another level of development, the housing, and more is going to come. Personally, I've changed my fight, if you will, from strictly a fight about race to a fight about, you know, the new urbanism. I want to create an urban, dynamic place, and I'd like to leave my mark, if nothing else. People in the Camdens, the Trentons, but especially the Newarks of the world will say, I had a lot to do with the rebuilding of the city. That Timbuktu ain't that far, you know, behind after all.